a passage from Sir Chompley of Firth's 12th century English battles, skirmishes, and armed conflicts documented amongst the nobility and crusading orders during the reign of King John and Henry III in the northern Moor region. In October of that year, Hospitaller records claim that a small unit of knights and their squires, traveling to obtain a tithe of harvested food from a tenant farmer, was set upon, quote, most brutally and without decency. All of the group's knights, including their leader, Brother Hugh of Asper, were reported as slain by 3 surviving squires, who made an oath that the forces that attacked them were in the livery of Lord Richard of Borsley. Correspondence between the Bishop of Lincoln and Lord Borsley refuted this accusation, and promised to send his man Oswald, often referred to as the Bastard, to, quote, seek the truth of these matters. The missing knights and their order's chief tithe collector in the region were described as unable to be discovered in subsequent letters. It was reported that the land was now abandoned, the tithe of the goods missing, and the tenant farmer's home burned to the ground. Politically, the losses of the Knight brothers removed a strong stabilizing influence in the region. Many documents before this time list Brother Hugh of Asper as attending the signing of treaties and mediating between nobles. With his presence gone, the Moors soon saw an increased armed conflicts among the nobility. It wasn't until 1957, during the Moor regional land recovery programs, that when draining a local pond, the remains of 5 men were discovered. Their bodies had been tied with rocks and sunk sometime in the 12th century. These remains were found to have suffered numerous crossbow wounds that led to their death.
Hello and welcome to the Plastic Pressgang podcast, an aspirationally monthly podcast about historical wargaming and how to take it less seriously. I'm Calvin, I use he, him pronouns, and I'm joined as always by my co-host.
I'm Eric, I also use he, him pronouns.
And today we're talking about good and bad ideas for armies and projects. Normally, I am full of bad of them.
Yeah, so this is sort of an ode to both of our tendencies, and is really about sort of how to plan an army. So, you know, we're still technically in the new year. Everyone's New Year's resolutions are fading away. Gyms are becoming less crowded. But there is often this notion of like a new year, a new army, or there's a lot of games and stuff coming out right now. So really, how do you sit down and plan a historicals project? We're going to go through some good examples of stuff we've done well, and some cautionary tales of stuff we haven't done. But before we do that, the usual sort of hobby progress. Calvin, you've been painting a whole bunch. How's that going?
Good. I finished the dwarves that I talked about last time. They are painted and based on a shelf behind me. I started work on a weird project in the form of I'm writing my own rules for the first time, which God help me. This shit's hard. For What a Democracy, stealing that from Eric. I've also been doing lots of basing and, as I put it, hobby chores, where it's just, this is not something that's like the most fun thing in the world, but I'm just going to sit down and get it done so it's out of my way and I don't have to think about it. For example, I have my lens necks out for the first time in a year, and that's because I gave Eric another terrible, no good idea.
Yeah, but you're doing basing on those, and as you said, putting them on their final base, because those guys have hopped around in terms of how you want to put them on the ground a couple times.
Yeah, I'm also still poking around at like how I want to do some things. Like originally it was like, oh no, I'm gonna have the Doppel soldiers be their own unit. Oh, now I'm just thinking about it. It's like, no, they're better as just like an upgrade to slap on the front and maybe field as a small unit.
That makes sense. In typical style, I have been doing less painting than Calvin, mainly working on the first 500 points of a Baron's War force, mainly trying to get the archers done. The archers did really well in our first game, which we'll talk about, and so they are rewarded with paint. Currently, and I talked to Calvin a little bit about this, I'm in sort of a crisis of confidence because they are in the ugly phase. They are in the brown contrast, hose and dirty shirts, etc. phase before they get the sort of the nice heraldry colors, because they cover well, go on last. So like right now they don't have their green tunics or their black tunics or metallics, and so they sort of look like ass. And so I quit painting one night at, man, these all look like ass. And also I'm painting like 7 of them, which for me is a bunch. I don't back paint. And so there's like a wall of archers that look like ass. So one of today's projects when we're done recording is to push past the ugly phase with some of them. I think I'm going to do the thing where I've sort of gotten them to the point, and now I'm going to lavish each one of them with attention for a bit. Other than that, we had one nice day this week, and so I primed a bunch of stuff for an upcoming sort of Viking event that we're doing, possibly in March, definitely in June. Like, that needed to get primed. I wanted to do it with sort of proper spray primer rather than airbrush primer. That's done for some of the stuff, but that at least lets me be able to start airbrushing that terrain.
Hell yeah.
Then there's also games played, which we've had a bunch.
Yeah, so we did a Baron's War day where each of us, where there were 2 games total that got played between the 3 people who were there. I played 2, everyone else played 1, and we discovered that crossbows don't fuck around.
Yeah. So basically what we did is we had 2 people playing and the third person acting as referee, frantic rules looker upper. Baron's War is a great game, but it is definitely on the more granular side. So there's a lot of like, okay, but can X do Y? What is the implication of this? What does it mean to be given a free, to act as if they have been given a free defensive action? Oh, okay. So I GM'd the first one, and then Russell GM'd the second one. The one between Russell and Calvin is what you heard in our cold open. Yeah, Baron's War is really great. It's a really fun game. The 2 things I think I got from it are we had a very dense board for terrain, and that is correct. That game needs a lot of terrain, which is okay because it's a fairly small skirmish game, but you want a dense board. And the reason for that is the second thing I learned, which is that ranged attacks, generally speaking, are very dangerous. Crossbows are dangerous if you get close to them. The ability for anything but green archers to both move and shoot at long range means you're probably going to take a fair amount of fire from them. They're less dangerous than we thought they were, but not dangerous.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot to be said for being able to hide, to take cover, things like that, because I think if you are trying to play on Planet Bowling Ball, whoever brought a bunch of missile troops wins. I did notice for event play, I've been reading the FAQ for fun, which is always a bad sign, but this is the age we live in. And I did notice that there's a special little section called event rules. And in event rules, the number of ranged models you can bring is capped at 25% of your army. And I believe there's a reason for that.
Yeah, thinking about that right now, it's like, well, there's that entire army essentially no longer functional.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to ignore that. I think we're going to ignore that generally, but I think because I think the thing is I'm going to bring a bunch of missile troops is in that game very vulnerable to that guy who will immediately make that extremely unfun. And so I think that's a way to sort of avoid bad times at events, which is something you want to avoid because people at events pay to be there.
Yeah, versus me just continually playing the most annoying things I possibly can.
Yeah, like it's one thing to have someone do something because like this seems like a thematic and amusing thing versus like this is the optimal way to do this.
Mounted crossbowmen, here we come.
Yeah, mounted crossbowmen, here we come. Along those same lines of new games we're trying, we also played on Friday night, which was 2 nights ago, Raven Feast, which is developed by Little War TV, and it is a Viking Age skirmish game that is designed to be your first historicals war game, and very possibly your first miniatures war game generally. So it's a very simple system, relatively small number of troops, roughly, I'd say a warrior or Hearthguard heavy saga warband worth of troops. And it was a lot of fun. I mostly, again, GM'd while Calvin played a fellow club member in an intro scenario where they were both trying to loot a town. And yeah, I thought that went fairly well.
It's definitely a fun game. We just have to keep ourselves from wanting it to be more than it is.
Yeah, I think the 2 things I took out of it, and one thing we need to plan, because we're planning this as like a demo game, con game, things like that. The 2 things I got out of it were, you have to remember it's an intro war game. It does not have a lot of granularity to it. There are a lot of things where you're like, well, surely X should do Y. And the answer is, no, stop it. One good example is, you can get past someone as long as you don't touch their base. There is no zone of control. There is no within 1 inch, etc. If you can squeak by, you can squeak by. So I think letting it be what it is important, and avoiding the instinct to want to essentially house rule Ravenfeast into being Saga. And then also that in that game, and I think this is appropriate, 2 shield walls grinding against each other is a, not tedious, but is a long process for that to then crumble.
Which turns out, hey, guess what?
Yeah, which is accurate. And so I'm at peace with it. But it's something to remember for like fun versus accuracy. How do you want to set this up? We had 2 largish shield walls grinding against each other for an objective. And that was, frankly, somewhat brutal. And then one of them broke and collapsed. And then the other one broke and started also taking fairly severe casualties. This is how the world works. And I think is actually, if we think about it as a demo war game, a really good sort of introduction to that cascading morale panic cycle that a lot of historicals games have. But I thought it was a good game. It was fun. And yeah, anything else we want to talk to?
Well, we have an idea to go with it too, because the people at Little Wars TV were also kind enough to write up rules for mythological stuff to go with it. So you can fight a dragon and have your own, beautiful, beautiful Viking saga. Which is why Karazai, the massive fuck-off dragon from the Stormcast range, might be showing up to get killed by some Vikings.
Which I think will be a fun sort of co-op, somewhat less serious, smaller army demo games. I think we can sort of alternate between those depending on people's vibe, letting them pick if they want to, fight their little brother or if they want to go kill a dragon. Because, yeah, that seems like a fun scenario. And dragons are always cool. That one's also pretty lightweight on terrain because it'll just be lots of trees. And then I got from Fogu Models, they had a Kickstarter recently for a charcoal burner's little station. So we'll put that. We're going to say the smoke attracted the dragon. Dragon got pissed that there wasn't another dragon there. And hilarity ensued. That's sort of our intro, what we've been doing. So now let's talk about how to plan a historical project.
We broke this down into a series of questions to ask yourself and then a few tips. So to start with the questions of, what are you doing? What do you want to show with this? What scale do you want to work at? What game do you want to use? Avoiding scope creep, and how to find ending and start points. And I am the bad example, and for that, I'm showing off my 28mm multiple brigade scale Napoleonic French and the lack of planning that went into them.
And as a good example, we're going to talk about the What a Stormtrooper demo game we set up last year, which is the one we picked because that is definitely, I think, our crowning moment of having planned something appropriately. Versus both of us have at least one project sitting half painted that's been neglected, etc. What a Stormtrooper is going to be our good example of sort of how we did this correctly.
Yeah.
So let's start with, what are you doing? And Calvin, what's sort of the idea behind this question?
So this is, why do you want to do whatever it is you're doing? So this is the idea that makes you do the thing. Could be a series of movies, could be a series, could be, you get a lot of interest in a specific period. It could be even, I want to play this game. And this is where this can get a little bit wishy-washy. For example, for my French, all I knew was I wanted to do historicals. And Napoleonics seemed like the thing to do. And so we started there.
That's not unfair. A lot of historical war gamers get started there. And if you say, I do historicals, what people picture is a Napoleonic army. But I think one of the important things here is to really articulate what you're doing, because it will also help determine things that come later. Because if you think about sort of, let's use a Viking Age example, what do you want to represent for the Vikings can range from like, I want a down-to-earth, gritty, accurate representation of Viking versus Anglo-Saxon warfare. That's one way to approach it. The other one is like, the Vikings TV show seems dope. I would like to represent that. That is a very different type of game. And so what you want to do will help inform everything from your models. Like, do you want Lagertha as a character in your Viking army? Probably depends on how historical you want to root things in. all the way to like if you're using Annie Norman stuff, like do you want Freya and her giant cats to show up? And like yes. So there's things like that. And then that also sort of dictates what sort of vibe you want. So when we started doing What a Stormtrooper, we were like, we want to do a Star Wars game. And then we were both like, no, what we really want is the like dusty town in Tatooine with the Mandalorian theme playing in the background. Like that's the feeling we want. And so that then helps inform everything that follows along, which we'll talk about as we talk about it. But like, that's what we wanted, is like that music playing in the background, whether it's in your head or on a Bluetooth speaker. That's the vibe we wanted. This is what we want this to do. So then that hops very easily into what do you want to represent, which is sort of this question of like how granular you want to be. Again, do you want the grand battles of this? Do you want this to be accurate? Like, you know, for Black Powder and Epic Black Powder, Warlord Games puts out books with the orders of battle there. Do you want to be able to point to your army and go, yeah, this is Blucher's Prussians at Waterloo on day 2? Or do you sort of want, this is unnamed people somewhere in Europe at a time? So like our Baron's War campaign is ahistorical. No one is playing the Baron of Shrewsbury, whoever that happens to be. It is stylized. These are not people who would not exist, but there is no historical part of this. Like one of them lives in a town that I have no idea if anyone like actually ever held that town. So it is like the vibe should be accurate. So Calvin, do you want to talk about how you did this for your French?
I didn't. I kind of just got models that looked neat and kept going on them until I realized I had way too many of them. And like, because this can be anywhere from a similar example that worked better was this is the French Napoleonics again, but I did them at like the sharp practice size of like, this is a skirmish somewhere in Spain. That ended up being way more what I wanted. And that ended up being something that I finished really quickly, actually, and got done really fast, versus I'm still grinding through all my French Napoleonics, like getting them based. There's still more I need to add to them, but I just can't be bothered.
And I think that's one of the big questions here is if you said something like, I want to do the Napoleonic French, is that the French at Austerlitz? Is that the French in the retreat from Moscow? Is that the Peninsular War? Is that Waterloo? Those all have different implications to them, as do things like, again, we said sort of what vibe do you want? Like, did you grow up watching the Sharps TV series with Sean Bean and you want that? Good news, you don't actually have to paint all that many dudes because those were almost all small scale skirmishes. Versus like, if you do want, you know, Napoleon at his peak, absolutely crushing the Austrians, yeah, you're going to have to paint a lot of Frenchmen. But they will be Frenchmen who seem like they're in good order versus like Frenchmen in shambles. That's a thing that you have to decide, and it will often have implications for the scale of the project, the scale of the game. We'll bring this up, but the scale of the table you need to play on. Those things will all follow from that. So to talk about one where we, I think, did this really well, when we set out to do What a Stormtrooper, we had a plan. We wanted to do this for what's called Vandal Overnight, which is a thing the University of Idaho hosts every year before finals. They essentially have a gaming convention, and our club usually gets a couple tables at it, and we wanted to do a easy pick up, put down multiplayer. People are passing by, go, ooh, what's this? And we go, would you like to play a game? Sort of in the style of the old Games Workshop store. We have, 5 Gene Stealers and 4 Tactical Marines set up on a table, and I run you through a game of 40K that uses about a fifth of the rules 40K does. So for this, we're like, this is a skirmish game. People should not have to keep track of that many units. So we're going to go for like small gangs of between like 2 and 4 people. And that's what we started with. And that worked really well because, first of all, it's not that hard to paint small gangs of between 2 and 4 people. And then also for that limited, because like with Star Wars, you have tons of options. You could do a full-scale battle with, ATSTs and essentially glorified sci-fi technicals and snow speeders and tons of dudes and stormtroopers and Darth Vader, and we're like, nope, we want none of that.
That would be too much to throw at someone.
Yeah, that's too much to throw at somebody. We want to be like, here are your 3 people. This one does this. This one does this. This one does this other thing. Have fun. And so that's sort of what we wanted to represent is, again, that sort of, if we think about back to The Mandalorian as a TV show, there's not that many big battles. There's lots of skirmishes between a couple people on each side. That's what we wanted to go with. The next question, now you've sort of got it dialed in and you're like, okay, here's what I want to do. What scale do you want to do it at? And that includes both sort of scale in the sense of the size of the game and also the scale in terms of the size of the little toy soldiers.
So this will help you decide what models you want to get. Whether you want to get, I need 300 15 millimeter tall, Union soldiers because I want to do like Antietam. And you're like, okay, cool. Let's crack in on that and, go, okay, you're probably not going to want the like uber complicated, super dynamic models from somewhere else at 28 mil if you need to do 300 of them. You can look at, plastics, there's resin models you can look at, metal models for the classics, 3D printing if you want to go that way, and, try to find different people to do it. My example is I have mostly the Warlord, like 2-3 part Frenchman for my Napoleonic French. And I kind of don't like them. They are the absolutely most fine Napoleonic models I think I've seen. There is 0 things wrong with them, but there's nothing that's like 100% I love this model. Similarly, I have their metal Grenadiers of the Old Guard, and I kind of wish I'd gotten the Victrix plastic kit after I'd gotten the Victrix Chasseur Apied of the Imperial Guard. So it's like I wish I'd done a little bit more research on what to get before I did it.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things here that I think about when thinking about scale. One is, what do you want to paint? 28 millimeter has the nice ability that you get a lot of canvas to work with. There are games that have bigger scales to them. Whereas if you want to get a lot of people on the table quickly, smaller scale miniatures are good for that. Classically, if you look at what it takes to paint a Horus Heresy army versus what it takes to paint a Legions Imperialis army, the Legion Imperialis army is much, much easier. Airbrush them all yellow and you have an Imperial Fist army. So there is definitely benefits and drawbacks to that. So one of the things is, if you want a big battle, maybe consider a smaller scale. And that will give you potentially 2 different things. A, easier to paint miniatures, and cheaper miniatures for the quantity you're talking about. Like, I want 300 Union soldiers is a starter set for something in like 6 or 8 millimeter, whereas that's a big army at 28 millimeter. That also potentially gives you a lot of room on the same size table. So one of my complaints about all historicals games played on 6x4 tables at 28 millimeters is there is very little maneuvering. Very few people get flanked because they were outmaneuvered. They get flanked because their flank collapses. And that's because there's just not that much room on a table that size. Whereas if you're using miniatures that are a half to a quarter of the size of 28 millimeter miniatures, there's a lot more room. So you can spread out. You can have multiple brigades converging from different locations. And that's a thing that is sort of tenable at that scale. So, for example, that's what we've done when we were talking about sort of some of our Cold War games, which we will probably get into more next year. Yeah, like we want to play smaller armies firing at longer ranges. So we want small scale miniatures on a big table. So there's a lot of things there. I think one of the things is also to think about, can you mix manufacturers? So to use a 30 Years War example, because it's the Warlord stuff I'm familiar with, again, their pikemen are adequate. Their musketeers are fine. They're not great, but importantly, as far as I can tell, they're the only people who make them in plastic. So if you want a pike block, maybe your back rows are Warlord plastics, and your front row is the much more characterful, much more vibrant models from somewhere like Bloody Miniatures. So you can do that. You can supplement things and be like, okay, my characters are going to be from a different manufacturer. These particular units are going to be from a different manufacturer. My skirmishers are going to be from a different manufacturer. So, for example, when we did What a Stormtrooper, we sourced our models from 2 different sculptors.
Skullforge and Darkfire Designs.
There we go. And that's because each of them had a couple units that really spoke to us. They had good quality files. They were both making things at roughly 32 millimeter scale. That's slightly larger sort of Shatterpoint style design. And importantly, they were doing it as things at a scale where 3D printing is viable. So again, it's easy to 3D print a skirmish army. That's not hard. I am a avid 3D printer with a fairly reliable large bed 3D printer. And if someone said, I'm going to fully 3D print my Horus Heresy army, my answer would be, you're nuts. Hear me out. A bunch of it's made in plastic. But here, yeah, we need some stormtroopers. I think I printed every stormtrooper pose that they had for Calvin, and then we used like 3 of them for this game.
Yeah.
A couple rebels, a couple characters. That's at this point. So at the time I had a smaller printer. At this point, that's a single build plate. That's an afternoon of work. So that's how we did that. Is we said, okay, we want this at a skirmish scale. We want to do some cool terrain. So we also decided we wanted a 6x4 tables worth of terrain so that people could move. They could sneak around things. This wasn't immediately sort of a gunfight in a cantina and that like the guys with rifles had things to do. So yeah, that's what we decided to do. And similarly for manufacturing, the answer is there's a company called Imperial Terrain that makes legally distinct from Star Wars terrain at the right scale, and it is easy to print. And so it was just like, all right, I'm going to source some stuff from them. I bought it on sale at some point, and I'm just going to print it. And I'm going to print a lot of it. And that's where we went there. So that's sort of the question of scale is both, genuinely speaking, what scale do you want it at? Because that will also limit your number of manufacturers. Like if you want a huge game at like 6 millimeter, there's only so many people making 6 millimeter figures for your particular conflict.
It's Bacchus.
Maybe Peter Pig. But like that's it. Versus, you know, if you're talking about 28 millimeter, there's potentially, and especially if you're talking about something like 28 millimeter Napoleonics, there is a vast sea of options. The same thing is true for World War II. So it's also possible that what you can do here is sort of starting from reverse. You can say, I want to use so-and-so's miniatures. What game can I play with those?
That could be, you know, what are you doing? You can go, I want to use those models. And then you can answer all these questions. And
so like a couple examples of that I can sort of speak to. Again, if you want bloody miniatures, like if you look at those and you're like, those are the coolest 30 Years' War, English Civil War models I've ever seen, they are meant for skirmish games. They are characterful, they are dynamic, they are expensive. Bloody Miniatures has just come out with, I suppose these guys are okay for a second rank of pikemen. So you really don't want to embark on a massive battle project with those miniatures. But if you want to do a more skirmish style game, great. They'll look awesome. In contrast, when Empress Miniatures did their British Paratroopers Kickstarter, I went, these are beautiful. And now I have enough of them for a very, very large bolt action or chain of command army because they made a lot. And so I think that is another way to do this, is to go, I want this model or this range of models to show up on the table. How do I do that? And this helps segue into, what game are you doing?
So step one here is, with the models that you have and the scale you want to do things at and what you want to do, what games can do that? Because you have to keep in mind all those things when looking at all the different rule sets. Because, for example, for Napoleonics, you ask 49 wargamers their favorite Napoleonics rule set, you'll get 50 answers. Because there are that many. Because they continue to make them, and it could be whatever. Some areas you might be a little bit more limited, like, for example, the one we've run into is like the Franco-Prussian War. We continually kind of find things that are fine, and then we promptly kind of go, but there's like 4 options.
There's like 4 options. There were 3 until Valor and Fortitude came out. And that is, I'm pretty sure, just because the Perry brothers wanted to sculpt Franco-Prussian War miniatures, and like, because they're the Perry brothers, called Jervis Johnson and were like, we need a Franco-Prussian War rule set. And out comes one of the options for Valor and Fortitude. There are other periods where you are fairly set for a number of different options, but they have very different scales. So like for World War II, do you want a game where there's 15 tanks on the table, or a game where 1 tank is an unusual appearance? Those are different games. You've got another area that has sort of frustratingly few options is the 30 Years' War, especially if you want something more skirmishy. There's not a whole lot of options. I really want In the Buff to come out soon.
If the 2 Fat Lardies people are listening, please, we would like to look at it.
Yes, I do historical reviews for Goonhammer. Hit me up. Beyond that, for Napoleonics, Calvin, what did you go with? And what did you think about when you decided that?
Well, I went with Black Powder. And I'm not mad I did, because Black Powder works. And sometimes that's all you need. It's just the game does the thing. Is it perfect? No. Can I teach it in 20 minutes? Yes. But there's still so many flaws in it that might just need to get whacked out and or choose a different one. Like, for example, Valor and Fortitude looks interesting, and I think we can play it with the models I have. Or it could be like, let's try, I don't know, General d'Armée, which I don't think I have enough models for.
What's the one that was playing on Seventh Son recently?
Soldiers of Napoleon.
Soldiers of Napoleon. That one seemed neat. This is the danger with Napoleonics, is because all of these things also pick what aspect of that conflict they want to focus on, what hyperfocus the rules writer has in their brain at that particular moment in time. And so you will get slightly different feelings to things. One thing for either older listeners or older listeners at heart, the saying, nobody ever got fired for buying an IBM. Nobody ever got fired for playing a game from Warlord. They are, in the historical space, the big manufacturer. So like if you have people playing historicals, odds are they play Bolt Action or Black Powder or Hail Caesar.
If your group plays Pike and Shot regularly, hit us up. We want to meet them.
I would love to meet them, and I'm fascinated by that. There are definitely sort of safe games, and this is a thing that also depends on sort of where you are. So like right now, Calvin and I live in a place where we are both intending to continue to live here, and we have a built-in play group. So you can be like, hey, I want to play this weird game. Does anyone want to play it with me? And you'll get some traction versus like when I was in graduate school, I moved a lot. My summer employment was in New Jersey. Graduate school was in North Carolina. My girlfriend was in either Chicago or DC. So there was a lot of moving around. For me, portability and the ability to show up to a game store and say, hey, does anyone play this? Was really valuable to me. And that's why I played 40K. Wherever you go, people play 40K. They also play a bunch of other games. And so I have a string of games that I was definitely going to play. And then I moved, and then no one in my new area plays them. So like I had some Flames of War British Paratroopers for a while. I had a War Machine army for a while, etc. And so that's one of the things is like there is some safety in playing a Warlord game. And like Rick Priestley is a legendary designer for a reason. But it's definitely a house style versus some other games. So for What a Stormtrooper, we sort of reverse engineered this. We sort of wanted to play What a Cowboy because it seemed like a very good system. But we wanted something that would have much more immediate appeal to people outside historicals as like, yeah, I want to play that. And like Star Wars is one of the largest pop culture franchises in the world for a reason. It's cool. So we're like, okay, what else does Westerns well? Oh, Star Wars. There you go. And so for that one, we sort of reverse engineered this. Because again, all of these questions you can enter this sort of like, this isn't a flow chart where you have to go A, B, C, D. You can enter at any sort of part of this question and start building up from there. So occasionally I have also gone, I want to play a particular game. This seems neat. What do I need to do this? So like, the actual good example is Soldiers of Napoleon. I have never been closer to starting a Napoleonic's army, except that game and some of the dynamics represented in that game seemed cool.
We should see how close I can get to that with
just
what I have.
Just the nonsense you have. Yes, the best army is also the one your friend has already painted. So that's a way to do things. Similarly, I did not really have a terribly big interest in the Viking Age until I got interested in playing Saga. And then was like, oh, this is great. And then discovered that Victrix plastics exist and was like, oh my God, the world is open to me. And now I've gone down a rabbit hole.
I will counter that statement with, you knew you liked the Viking Age. We talked about it.
Yeah, I liked the idea of it. No particular game or plastics had really grabbed me, because what I was exposed to was like the Warlord Viking stuff for Hail Caesar, and meh. Versus like I really liked what I saw from that. So like it's an interesting thing where like something can just sort of flip a switch and have you be like, no, but this is what I want to play. So we have gone through sort of our flowchart of how to think about a project and how to flesh out what it is you want to do. Because as Calvin has sort of alluded to, if you just want to go, I want Napoleonic French, that potentially ends in frustration. So let's talk about some other considerations, notably scope creep.
Scope creep is a bitch. It's going to pop up as, the Columbo, just one more thing.
If I painted another squad, I could X. So like, this is especially true, I think, for army size. I'm going to use a medieval example because it's what I'm sort of thinking about right now. The sliding scale of like Baron's War or Saga to a game like Lion Rampant or Blood and Crowns to a game like Hail Caesar is really, really easy. So like going from Saga to Lion Rampant is like add a few guys. And then you get a Lion Rampant army and you're going, a Lion Rampant army is a small Hail Caesar army. And all of a sudden, your very well-behaved war game in a single bag of Victrix models project, it has gone off the rails. The counterpoint to this, and this is where I think scope creep gets really hard, is you can build armies with multiple games in mind and say, yeah, I'm going to start this as a Saga army, but I can see myself wanting to play something a little larger, so I'm going to keep that this should be compatible with Lion Rampant. So like Lion Rampant, units tend to come in 12s or 6s. So maybe even though warriors in Saga are 8 dudes, I'm going to paint 12. That's not bad, but there's definitely the invitation for scope creep. And you have to decide sort of if you're okay with that. And our, I think, joint recommendation is to try to guard against it, because it will naturally happen. And some of it will happen whether you want it to or not. So, because like a cool thing will come out. A good example of that is even for our club demo army for Pikeman's Lament. I bought and assembled, and Calvin is painting a couple extra units because we want people who are interested to have a little variety. And like, maybe you would like to try what a cannon is like. Or maybe you would like to try a bigger game. Like, there's scope creep for that, and that is as constrained an army project as either one of us has ever embarked on. For What a Stormtrooper, we finished that, and I was like, this is great. We should play with full-size gangs and do a campaign.
I mean, the other fun thing on that, actually this might be for the next section, is the first thought we had after we finished it was, what do we want to add to this?
Exactly. This was successful. Where do we want to go from here? So along that line, when you're planning things, keep terrain in mind. Scope creep happens here too. Right now, We have a single board that's 6x4 for What a Stormtrooper. Do we want more? Do we want a board that is not the middle of town? Do we want, a rocky canyon where your, speeder bike will get ambushed? Do we want a moisture evaporator farm because we're on Tatooine? All of a sudden, I have just articulated 3 tables of terrain that have to be built or printed and painted, etc. I have caught myself doing this for some projects of mine where I suddenly realize I have committed to like 6 tables of terrain in my mind. And that's probably not a great idea. Also remember this in terms of what terrain do you have that you can use as you think about a project. Goonhammer just had a really good article on timeless terrain and essentially what terrain pieces span huge swaths of time. If you have a Napoleonic's army and you have Napoleonic's terrain, good news. Rural France hasn't changed that much. You can probably get away with a adorable little French village in the First or Second World War, or definitely the Franco-Prussian War. You can probably go back in time a little bit, and it will also work. Whereas, like, if you are pinballing between, like, I want to do Carthage versus Rome and the Soviets in the Second World War, you will need 2 freestanding terrain collections. This will also change based on scale. You can probably get away between 28 and 32 with the same size terrain collection. Smaller scales, if you're doing 10 or 15, that'll be a thing. Importantly, it's important to keep in mind that while 10 and 15 both sound like small, one is 50% larger than the other one. So if you have 15 millimeter terrain, you don't have 10 millimeter terrain. You definitely don't have 8 millimeter terrain. And depending on how fussy you want to be, you might not even have like Warlord's epic scale, which is somewhere between 12 and 13 millimeters. So pondering how much terrain you need, this again gets to the same questions of like, what do you want to do with scale? If you are doing the 30 Years' War, do you need a star fort? The answer is yes. But do you need a star fort? What does that mean? Like, your 5 guys aren't going to storm a fortress. So you now need dudes and a pretty big table versus, okay, maybe we don't need that. If we're doing What a Stormtrooper and we want a spaceport, sure, we can have vehicles there. Those vehicles are terrain, not things that can move and shoot, etc. So this is, again, that scope creep thing of going, oh man, what would be really cool is if we had a village and the burnt out version of that village. Yes, that would be immensely cool. That is 2 whole tables of terrain. Do you want to do that? And so, Calvin, this was really your point, this notion of start and end points.
Yeah. So the start point is, okay, if I do X, I can go from there. Like, this could be a starter box. A starter list. For example, for the Barons' War, my starting point was I'm going to get this box of the Chosen Men, and we'll go from there and see where I end up. And I knew the end point was enough to do 1,000 points for the campaign. So that is a start point and an end point. This is where scope creep between those 2 points is fine. Just know where you're going to stop. However, this can be also a little bit more fluid. For example, I've determined that my British and Germans in North Africa are essentially never going to be 100% done, but that is the point of them, is that they are going to always be a thing I can add to and have an extra thing. Because the starting point was I have enough for a bolt action army of both. That was the start point. The end point is do whatever I want with them. And that's a good thing to keep in mind. Like, an example of a good start point is my most recent purchase for the Barons' War was stuff for Outremer, where I was doing Saracens. Originally, I was just like, I was just putting stuff in my cart that looked cool, and I was like $150, and I'm like, crap, do I need all that? So then I went back, I wrote a list for the game, and went, oh, I only need this many. I can pick up the other stuff later, but like, that is a good start point, is I have a list I can use for the thing.
I think one of the big things with the start point, and I'm going to reiterate the comment for Baron's War, Footsore comes out with starter sets that are 500 point armies that come with the rulebook. They are brilliant. If you're interested in the Baron's War, just buy one. That is where you should start. Particularly, there is both a beginner retinue and the Chosen Men. Either one are a perfectly good one to start with. The Angry Monks one is, I think, a little bit harder, as is the Outlaws for a new player. But regardless, I think one of the important parts of the start point is a lot of people want to play games. The difference between miniatures wargaming and military scale modeling is we get to play games with our things. A good start point is what lets me play a game, so you get the dopamine hit of playing a game. So like the Baron's War starter sets are a really good one for that. That's an army. You paint it, you field it, that you could be done there. But it at least gives you a place to start. I think the end point, it is valuable to have one or know you do not have one. So for example, for me, there are projects where I have an endpoint. My endpoint for Baron's War is a little bit different from Calvin's. I want 3 1,000 point forces, which is enough to play the Death and Taxes campaign at its maximum size, with each of those armies being distinct. That's my endpoint. My endpoint for like the 30 Years' War at 28 millimeter is similarly, I don't have one. As Bloody Miniatures comes out with things, or other people come up with cool new models, I will paint nonsense for that period. And I do somewhat aspire to the things you occasionally see in wargame magazines where someone's like, Jesus Christ, that's a lot of sweets. Similarly, you can have larger projects that you hang projects off of. So in our alternate history episode, I talked about the sort of Ireland entering the Second World War on the side of the Allies. That is actually multiple projects. And so the Greater Ireland project doesn't really have an endpoint, but it has a bunch of discrete start and end point forces hanging off it. So like, I want an Irish Commandos Army 4 bolt action. That is a start and an end point, and a pretty easy one. And when that's done, that's done. I don't want 6,000 points of Irish Commandos. Similarly for the Irish and Cruel Seas. My start point was I want enough motor torpedo boats to play a game of Cruel Seas. The end point is that and one of every large ship, so I can play whatever suits my whim. And once that's done, it's done. And so I own everything I want to ever have for Cruel Seas. Occasionally they come out with new stuff, and about half the time my answer is meh. Having a start and end point, I think, is really important. Otherwise, projects end up half finished, and you don't really have an endpoint where you can go, okay, but if I really just push through. So like, that's the current thing with Baron's War, is I've got this 500 point starter force. If I push through, I've got 500 points and they're done. And then if I do another 500 points, that 1,000 point part of the army is done. Versus much more vague, I want dudes in mail. Is I think a much harder one to sort of manage. And that also lets you like riff off that a little bit. So like, oh yeah, but this really cool figure has come out. Cool, add that one really cool figure. Again, to talk about what a Stormtrooper, our start point was our end point. We need a table's worth of terrain and 4 gangs. That's it. If we want more, we can add more. But each one of those is sort of a start and end point all on its own. So like we have pondered doing full-size gangs. Okay, we do one of those. If we want another table, and I think that's the nice part about having something in an end point, is it's actually not an end point, it's a pause point. And you can say, okay, from here, here's what I want, and break that down into discrete chunks. Like, would I like full-size gangs to play with Calvin? Yes. I have this notion of a group of rebel naval troopers as just like, what if I just flood the zone with idiots? That's a discrete notion. I could do that, and again, do that and be done. So I think having start points and end points is really important. You can always set new ones. You can do that scope creep. You can embrace scope creep and go, okay, I really like Lion Rampant, but I'd really like a bigger game. Cool. I like another Saga Force. Like, I fully anticipate by the end of my time in the Age of Vikings, I will have 3 Viking armies and an Irish army. But finish one of them first, because there's a lot less utility in having 4 half-done armies than there is in having 1 finished army and 3 on the planning table. So I think that's the other piece of advice, is if you have a big project, break it up into small projects. We will talk about it at some point. I have a sort of grand scope imaginations type project. The first component of that is to be able to field enough people for a skirmish game. That's objective 1. For the conclusion and sort of wrapping all of this up, we wanted to talk about a project we're actually sort of in the nascent period of, which is the War of the Roses, aka the English Civil War we care about. We'll ignore that the Barons' War is also an English Civil War that we care about. So the War of the Roses, we're going to talk a little bit about thinking sort of as we go through this, what are our thoughts?
Yeah.
Galvin, would you like to go first?
Yes, because I'm the one who decided to start on this. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through the questions and the ideas and the other things you have to think about when doing this project. So we're going to do it in real time.
So Calvin, what are you doing?
I want to do stuff for the Barons' War because it has everything I love in a wargaming setting of larger-than-life characters, interesting stories, and cannons.
War of the Roses, not the Barons' War. You're already doing the Barons' War.
Yeah, I said War of the Roses. I don't know. Look, I hit my head yesterday. I'm okay to be a little bit off.
But yeah, that notion of what you have, which is cannons, characters, random plots and chicanery. These are things that obviously speak to you. And so that's what you want to do.
Yeah.
So that's great. That's what you're doing. What do you want to represent?
I want to represent something larger than lion. I want a small battle at most.
Okay. But you do want a battle that will get written down in a history book as thing took place here.
Yes. I don't want some fuckos dying in the woods. I want this was a significant event, but for example, what I don't want to do is I don't want to do Towton and Bosworth. I don't want to go that far.
So you don't want to recreate a big battle. Do you want to recreate a small battle, or do you want to do, again, a hypothetical? It is perfectly credible that 2 armies met here at this size and had a fight, but they just happened to not in this timeline.
I like both of those ideas. So that's kind of the area I'm aiming for. So not Towton, not 5 guys killing each other in the woods. Okay.
So that's a perfectly good articulation of that. What scale are you talking about, thinking about, both in terms of sort of game size and miniatures?
Game size kind of also leans into that, what I want to represent of This is not the entire world hinges on this one battle, but it's also not, whatever happened here, we don't care. And as for scale, because of all the wild, heraldry and various livery badges and how complicated things get, I can't imagine doing that something smaller than 28 mil. I think if I went to 15 or 10 mil, it would lose the visual impact that I think those deserve.
Yeah, I think if you go smaller, it is because you want to do a bigger battle. And that's not really where you're at. So I think about this a lot for the 100 Years' War, similarly, because Warlord is talking about coming out with an Agincourt set. You're not going to be able to do French heraldry justice at that level. On the other hand, you're talking about a largish battle.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that's okay. I think for what you're talking about, elaborate tabards with mud effects on them, etc., will be what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
And so I think that 28 millimeter makes perfect sense.
Also, it means I essentially have a one-stop shop for everything, because I could just go Perry site and start clicking random buttons,
This is true. That was what I was going to ask you, is have you picked a manufacturer? And the Perry brothers are not a bad one.
Yeah, because they do 1, 2, 3 infantry kits and 2 cavalry kits in plastic. So we can start there, and then they do everything else you could ever want in Metal, including characters. Because that's one of the things I love is the characters of the wars. So having models of them is important to me.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. Is if you are interested in the characters and the villains and heroes of that particular conflict, you want those villains and heroes. And one of the things that I think is important about the War of the Roses is you are still at the point where your officers can influence a particular action versus, in a lot of games it starts being like, well, your officer is mostly there to point at things and go, you three activate. So yeah, we've worked through that. So have you thought of a game system for this? And if so, what game system?
There's two that I'm looking at that are very similar as like the end point where I want to end this. This is going to be also me kind of pulling in the start end points, because the end point that I'm looking at is either Lion Rampant or more likely never mind the billhooks, because that is the scale I want to be at, where this is a battle that definitely happened, but it's not earth-shaking.
I could see like a big Lion Rampant game. We've talked about that a little bit, where like modify the rules so that you have two commanders, and if a commander fails, their unit stops working, but your army doesn't stop working. It's a potential way to do that. Or never mind the billets would be a good choice. So I'm going to ask you a question that invites scope creep. The Hail Caesar supplement for the War of the Roses dives deep into the shenanigans.
Yes.
Is that of interest?
Vaguely. That is not an end point. That is the after I hit my end point. We think about that because I'm looking at doing Richard III before he's Richard III. So that means like Tewkesbury and Barnet. This would be like, this whole project idea is like, would probably end up being a brigade for the Wars of the Roses, like Hail Caesar. Like this is one part of your force. Maybe you do a second one that's like, this is Edward.
If you're not exhausted and tired of painting and come to hate it.
Yeah.
Or feel the urge to do it. Or the other thing is, and this is one of the great parts of working in multiple systems, I'm pretty sure you can steal a bunch of the stuff from that supplement and graft it onto another game.
Yeah. Like, I'm sure everything in there we could grab and like, how does this work? And never mind the bill hooks. And we, slap it on there and it works fine.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about sort of how do you translate my finally promoted colonel in Pikeman's Lament to, like, how do you translate that to a character for Pike and Shot? And it's just not that hard. So I think that there's definitely something there. So yeah, we've sort of gone through this. I think that's an incredibly promising start. So let's talk about the last thing for this, because this generally becomes my problem. Terrain.
Terrain, we actually have a pretty good selection of later... Well, we have all the natural terrain we would ever need. Our late medieval terrain is slightly lacking. We have like 2 buildings. However...
One note is we have 2 buildings.
Yeah.
I have a whole ass box of buildings.
Exactly. And most of the stuff we have that isn't that, we can squint slightly and it'll probably work fine.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of things where, like, okay, take off the crenellated top of this castle, put on a roof. Ta-da! It's a slightly more updated castle. I think there's definitely some potential there terrain-wise. And yeah, as you said, if we want 2 armies meet across a river and have to fight over the crossing, that terrain we've got in wild abundance.
Also, to kind of bring up the point of, there is a start point on this, which is not make a Lion Rampant army. The start point for all of this is make 2 forces for here's the ruckus, because that is a very easy start point of 24 models.
Yep. So for those who aren't familiar with it, here's the ruckus is the skirmish version of never mind the billhooks. And so is a skirmish game. So to use Calvin's, this is not 5 men beating each other to death in the woods. Here's the ruckus is a little bit. Here are 5 men beating each other to death in the woods. But that does give you, as I said, that sort of dopamine hit of, I've got some models painted. I can play games with them. And then, man, I really like that. I should paint more, which starts getting you to the good place.
Mm-hmm. And if this ends up being really fun, who knows? Probably the actual next step after I finish out to the full, never mind the billhooks army. The next step is probably actually make a Lancastrian force up to never mind the billhooks level.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't know if that's something Eric's going to do.
I mean, in the fullness of time it would be, but we'll see. So yeah, I think that's one of the things. I think that's also an excellent point on planning projects that we did not mention that is worth discussing a little bit is, do you have a partner? And are they coming along for the ride with you? So for example, for our Baron's War campaign, we have at the very least 3 players, probably a 4th player. So that means you only have to worry about doing your thing. And you will have other people painting the army you have to fight. There are many games where it is either a specific interest of mine or a specific interest of Calvin's, where we have embraced that I will happily play this with you, but this especially comes up for me because I am a slow painter, but I cannot follow you on this journey. If you want to do this, you're painting both sides of it.
See, for example, my love of the Anglo-Zulu War. I'm not going to expect Eric to sit down and paint 96 Zulu warriors.
Yeah,
I'll do that.
That's not going to happen. If Calvin wants to play the Anglo-Zulu Wars, because it's fun, the Men Who Would Be Kings is a good game. Yeah, he's got to do that. Similarly, on the various GW specialist games ranges, I have both forces for many of those games. Because my answer is, if I want to play Adeptus Titanicus, I need to show up with 2 players worth of Titans. So that is a thing to sort of ponder whether you have a companion for. So like this Imaginations thing that I've been mulling about in my head. That's a me thing. I got to do both of them. Some of it is timeline based. Like we talked about the Franco-Prussian War a bit. Would I happily paint Prussians for that? Yes. Is that even on the radar? No. So if Calvin would like to play that this year, it's probably a Calvin thing.
Yeah, which I have behind me.
Versus Warlord's Epic Scale Push a Fight game. That is something where like Calvin and I are both interested in it. We have our respective sides, and it is on at least my to-do list. Similarly, Cruel Seas. I played with... Calvin brought both sides of that. I played the British, went, oh man, this is really fun. And bought a starter set the next day. So that is a question for planning, is how much of this do you have to do on your own? And the answer to that is either half of it or all of it, or in some sort of weird and luxurious standpoint where you have a commissioned painter on standby, none of it. And what you have to do is write a check.
I mean, you have 2 of them on standby.
Yes, and I do occasionally do this. Like for me, a lot of games where I know I'm going to have to provide the other side, I know in my heart of hearts I'm never going to get around to the other side. So I will pay a commission painter because I have a hang up about my models being commission painted. I don't have a hang up about the models of the person I'm playing against being commission painted. So I may hand it off to a commission painter. I have been thinking about doing this for some other games where 5 parsecs from home. There's a lot of random villains that I would like painted, but don't have time to. Maybe I talk to Calvin. No, if you have a partner in your particular endeavor, that also helps with motivation and scope creep. Because you can be like, hey, buddy, I thought we agreed that we'd stop at this point. Or that they can help you part of the way. So, am I necessarily interested in a army scale Lancastrians project? No. Am I interested in a random company of fuck ups for Here's the Ruckus? Sure. So is someone on there with you for a part of your journey? Merry and Pippin in the Lord of the Rings style. Yeah, I could definitely see doing that, because again, that's buy a box of parries, put more attention into them than you would if it was a full army, and then kick around random villages, slaughtering livestock and shooting at each other. And that sounds great. there's definitely that's an aspect of thinking about things that we didn't touch on, but I think is really important for planning. So, for example, in the Baron's War, our friend Russell is a project planner in his heart and soul, and so does adorable things like set deadlines that everybody but Calvin misses. But he's there to sort of keep us a little bit on track and be like, hey, we talked about this thing. Is everybody still working towards that thing? And that has been, at least for me, invaluable. That's, I think, it for this episode. Good luck with all your new projects, folks. Plan them well, plan and execute. And hopefully this has been at least, if not advice you feel like following, advice where you're like, oh, I feel seen. Because I think a lot of people end up getting really excited about projects, getting the dopamine hit from planning a project, and then things get a little bit out from under them. I know that's true for me.
And if you're going to start a new project, tell us about it in the comments.
Yeah, tell us about it in the comments. We have a Discord. If you're interested in that, get in contact with us. I believe we are Plastic Pressgang Podcast at gmail.com, or we are on a number of other hobby Discords. You can find us on various social medias. I am no longer on the Hateful Bird site. I am on Blue Sky as Variance Hammer. I also occasionally write a blog, Variance Hammer, at www.variancehammer.com. I've been meaning to get back to it. And I am also on Goonhammer as one of their historicals writers. That's www.goonhammer.com or goonhammer.com. And I'm there as usually VH Eric. Calvin, how can people find you?
I am technically on both the Hateful Bird site and Blue Sky. I just can't remember my username for Blue Sky, and I haven't been on Twitter in literal months. You can find me on Discords, where I'm normally Calvin or Plastic Press Gang Calvin. And if you really want to find me, I'm on Twitch sometimes at Nevermore Painting, where I am painting toy soldiers or I'm clicking on heads in various video games. And if this comes out before the 15th, I'll be doing an event most of the 15th. So come by, watch me try to paint toy soldiers and potentially get tortured for 12 hours.
And finally, if you want to support the podcast, primarily help us pay for a lovely editor, we are on Patreon at patreon.com/plasticpressgangpodcast. That gets you all kinds of things like access to the Discord, member shout out, voting power on stuff we should do, and there's a couple private communities for various levels. Feel free to join us there. It's a little quiet right now, but the more people are there, the more active it will be. You can also find me on the much more occasionally published Lost to the Nails podcast, which is about Warhammer related games, mostly at this point 8mm, with my co-host Brian, and the latest episode, which is currently being edited, also with Calvin, where we talk about the word bearers.
I love my shit weasels.
Yes, they're play villains. You will always have people happy to fight you. So with that, thank you all very much for tuning in, and have a good rest of your day.
Be safe.